and welcome to this program, Cavity Nesting Birds in Snag Habitat. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the programming team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month, we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is timber. To find more free programs, check out our web calendar at deschuteslibrary.org/calendar, or go to our YouTube channel to find recordings of programs like this one. Tonight's program has ASL interpretation. Thank you to our interpreter, Ms. Morton. Our presenter is Amy Berry. She received her Master's of Science from Oregon State University in 2017 and later went on to work for the OSU College Forest, where she helped design and implement monitoring protocol for woodpecker nests in managed forests. Amy has conducted wildlife research and surveys for various organizations across the Northwest, including the National Park Service, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Institute for Applied Ecology. Thank you so much, Amy, for telling us about snag habitat in the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight to share a subject near and dear to my heart, which probably not many people can say, which is snags, and specifically snags as habitat. So I'm going to be talking to you about the research that we conducted back in 2015 and 2016, where we looked at the long-term impacts of snags on nesting birds in Western Oregon. And as Laura mentioned, I did this with my two advisors, Joan Hagar, who worked for USGS, and Jim Rivers, who's a professor at Oregon State in the College of Forestry. So before we get going, let's start out with what exactly do I mean by a snag? So when I talk about a snag, I mean any standing dead or dying tree. And such as these examples you see here. And even though they're not much to look at, these are actually incredibly important structures to have on the landscape. They contribute back into the soil as they break down. You can see large limbs falling off of this one, bark, debris that's coming back into the soil. And so that really helps create these healthy soil systems when you have these dead structures that go back into the earth. They also store terrestrial carbon, which then gets cycled back into the soil. And they can help stabilize these steep hillsides. Many of our forested areas in the Pacific Northwest occur in very rugged, steep terrain, such as thinking about the Coast Range or the Cascades. You can see these steep slopes. So having these structures standing with these root systems really actually prevents a lot of erosion from happening in these areas as well. And it turns out that they are also incredibly important wildlife habitat. So in the Pacific Northwest alone, we have over 100 different species of wildlife that use snags. And over a third of those are cavity nesting birds, which is what we'll be really focusing on and talking about today. Birds use snags for a variety of different reasons. A major source is foraging. Woodpeckers and brown creepers and all different types of birds, even songbirds, will forage on insects that are up in the bark or up under the bark and deep in the snag as well. They'll use them for nesting, which is, you see here, this pileated woodpecker with two nestlings nesting in a nice snag, and storing food as well. This, on the other side here, are two acorn woodpeckers. And this structure is called a granary. And it's where acorn woodpeckers will peck holes in trees. And then in the fall, they'll collect acorns and store them. And they'll store thousands of acorns in these structures. They actually get used beyond multiple generations of acorn woodpeckers. So they're really, really amazing structures to see in person. And they highly depend on snags for these granaries. Other animals, squirrels and different animals, will also store food in old woodpecker cavities. And then a last use of snags is for protection and roosting sites, especially in the winter. These cavities that are formed can be great roosting sites for woodpeckers and protection for other species to get out of the elements. So they're just very, very incredible structures to have on the landscape. So although we know how important these structures are, unfortunately, the abundance of natural snags in the Pacific Northwest has been significantly reduced. And this has a lot to do with the way that our forestry practices have evolved. This obviously is a large clear cut, and then around it, you can see all this timberland that is really a lot of even aged timber. So you don't have like in the old growth forest where you have a lot of naturally occurring and developing larger dead trees, you really don't get that in these more intensively managed stands that are harvested more frequently. And then when they do harvest, or when there is dead wood that develops, it's removed during harvest because it presents a pretty serious safety risk for the workers that are out there. They're already working on these steep slopes in these conditions. So a lot of that dead wood that is generated or would naturally be generated is removed during this timber harvest. So starting in the 1970s, forest managers decided to start incorporating more wildlife habitat and more wildlife features into their forest management regimes. And one of the ways in which they do that is by actually creating snags. So rather than leaving the smaller dead snag trees that are more dangerous to harvest around, they'll actually take live trees, particularly ones that already have defects or may have large limbs that are falling off, which is great for wildlife anyways. And they'll cut the tops off and let these trees die and leave them on the landscape to become snags for bird habitat. And we know that these structures provide good habitat in the first 5 to 10 years. There's quite a few studies out there that have looked at their initial use. But prior to our research, there was really nothing that looked at these structures long term to say, how long are these useful for? What species are using them? And do they really provide good long-term habitat features in these landscapes? So that's exactly what our project addressed. I was working off of a project called CFERP, or the College of Forestry Integrated Research Project. It was started back in 1989 at Oregon State in Corvallis. Here we are in Corvallis. This was our research area. And this is just a map of the research stand. So this is called the McDonald Dunn Research Forest. And if you're ever in Corvallis, if you're in the area, if you haven't been to this research forest, it's absolutely amazing. I would highly recommend it. It has lots of hiking trails, mountain biking trails, wonderful birding opportunities and wildlife viewing opportunities, as well as being an incredible research forest. So it's really a great multi-purpose area. If you're in the Corvallis area, definitely check out the McDonald Dunn Research Forest and PV Arboretum. So anyways, here, these stands that I have highlighted, these are all part of our research stands. And we did have several different treatments that we looked at, so different types of harvest, but I won't be going into that amount of detail today. We'll just be looking more big picture. We didn't find really any significant differences among the treatments and how they were used. So we'll just really be looking at big picture among all treatments, how these snags were used by birds. So across these stands, they created large snags. They created 731 snags in total. They were all Douglas fir, so we had the same species, and Douglas fir is a very commonly harvested species and grown species out here, as you're probably well aware. And these were very large snags. They were an average of 17 meters tall and an average of 53 centimeters across. So these are definitely large enough for a lot of the larger species that we would want to be seeing using these as habitat, such as pileated woodpeckers. So this is just to give you an example of the different data points that we had, that we were working on, and that this research is coming out of. So here in 1989 to 91, this is when the snags were created across all the stands. And then about 5 years later, researchers came out and they looked at bird use as well as the condition of the snags. Again, another 5 years later, in 2001, they collected more data on how birds were using snags and the condition. And then the bird use piece kind of dropped off, and they didn't really have any data on how birds were still using these snags, if they were even still standing or providing any habitat for that about 15-year chunk, which is when we came in 2015. So our study, we had two main objectives. The first was looking at the snags and measuring different characteristics to see, first of all, were they still standing? Had they fallen after 25 years, or were they still available for use? And then looking at a lot of different factors that we use to determine decay and level of decay, such as bark cover. So how much bark is still remaining on the snag, how much has fallen off or sloughed off over time? Is it broken or does it remain intact? How many branches and limbs does it have on it, or have those started to break off and slough away? And these are all characteristics that foresters will use when they're looking at the habitat that they have on their stands to get like this external level of decay on these snags. And then the second thing that we wanted to measure, of course, was bird use. We wanted to see if birds were still using them, and if so, which species. And this is a picture of a black-capped chickadee who's using a little cavity on this snag. And then both of these objectives, we also then took our historic data and compared over time to see not only what is our contemporary use, but how have things changed over time, and how does that look different over those different time periods. So today, again, I'll just be talking about the bird use. I won't go into the extreme amount of depth on snag characteristics, but we will look at the bird use and the contemporary use, and then those changes over time as well. So in order to answer this question, we conducted observations of these snags to get at what birds were using it and what were they using them for. So in 2015, we sampled randomly 135 snags out of the total 731. And then in 2016, we sampled the same 135 snags, but we increased that by 50% to give us a total of 204 snags. And that increase is just to make sure that we're capturing any variation that we might have missed in the first year, and to really give us a robust data set to do a lot of analyses with. So in mid-April is when we started doing our surveys. So with our cavity nesters, they actually have a slightly earlier nesting period than many of our migratory songbirds. A lot of our cavity nesting species and our woodpeckers actually don't migrate. They stay here all year. So they can get a little bit of an earlier start when it comes to scoping out nest sites. And it does take them a little bit longer if they're creating cavities and trying to find the right nest sites. They'll often create multiple before they pick one. Sometimes they'll create multiple to throw off predators and things like that. So there's a lot more strategy that goes into their early nesting period. So we do start a little bit earlier when we're doing nest searching for these types of birds. So we visited each of the snags in our sample 9 to 10 times throughout the course of 10 weeks. So they each got visited once per week. And then we observed any use that we saw going on at the snag for 15 minutes at a time. And what we were doing is really recording any foraging, any nesting. When we did find a nest, we also would track that nest through to see if it was successful and how many fledglings they had. So overall, we ended up with more than 750 hours of staring at dead trees, which is a lot of time. I'm sure you can imagine to be out in the woods staring at dead trees and hoping that birds will come and use them. Whoops. We go back one slide here. So before we get into any more, I wanted to show you this picture to illustrate. So this is a northern pygmy owl, which is one of our cavity nesters that we have out here. And this right in the center here is actually his nesting cavity. But when he's sticking his head directly out of the cavity, they are almost perfectly camouflaged. And especially from a distance, it can be nearly impossible to see these guys. And that's the case with a lot of our cavity nesters. They're so well adapted to the area that they nest, to that different coloration and structure of the bark, that it really does take a lot of observation and a lot of time to understand and know if snags are being used and how they're being used. Not to mention the fact that they can get very, very quiet, especially when they have eggs. They're very, very quiet when they're around their nest cavity, as to not, attract any kinds of predators. So it took a lot of sleuthing and a lot of observation to be able to detect some of these cavity nesters in these snags. So I also want to just make sure that we're all on the same page with our different types of cavity nesters. So we have, when we're talking about these birds, we split them into two main groups. We have our primary cavity nesters, which includes strong excavators, such as this pileated woodpecker. Now, these species have a strong drilling bill, which is really well designed for drilling through hard wood. Other species in this category include northern flicker, hairy woodpecker, red-breasted sapsucker. So these are all considered strong excavators, and they can get through sound wood. They will typically create a new cavity each season. So they'll create a cavity, use it for nesting, and then they'll abandon it and leave that cavity open. And then our other type of primary cavity nesters are weak excavators, such as this chestnutback chickadee. And a red-breasted nuthatch is another good example of a weak excavator. So these species do not have a strong bill, as you can see, such as the pileated. They have this smaller picking bill, which is much better designed for picking through more softened and decayed wood. So they actually will create a brand new cavity from year to year, but they will also reuse and modify existing cavities. So they can be a little bit more flexible in that way, but they do require much more softened and much more decayed wood in order to make their nesting cavities, since they do have that small bill. And then our second main group of birds, of course, are secondary cavity nesters, and this includes a wide range of species. This is a purple martin pair. And again, this female in the nest cavity illustrates how well adapted and camouflaged many of these species are compared to this bright and brilliant male purple martin, who's much more easily seen. But other species in this group include violet green swallows, western bluebirds, pygmy owls and other owls, tree swallows. There are a lot of secondary cavity nesters. So these birds rely on snags and rely on cavities for nesting, but they actually cannot create their own cavities at all. So they're extremely reliant on the presence of these primary cavity nesters, and especially strong excavators like pileated woodpeckers, in order to have nest sites from year to year. So we often in forest management consider pileated woodpeckers to be a keystone species, since they will make these large cavities and then abandon them, which provides these great nesting sites and food storage sites and sheltering sites for a plethora of other species that rely on these cavities. So now we can get into some of our data, and what we found was only about 11% of our snags across the 2 years were still being used after 25 years of creation. So we had 2 different strong excavators that we found nests from. We had a single red-breasted sapsucker and then a single northern flicker nest. And then we had 2 red-breasted nuthatch nests and 32 chestnutback chickadee nests. So we had predominantly weak excavators and predominantly chickadees that were using these snags after 25 years. So this really already starts to tell us a lot about the condition that these snags are in. They have to have high levels of decay in order for these weak excavators to be able to create nest sites. So we also wanted to look at foraging. So we didn't see a lot of use nesting. Well, it turns out we also didn't see a lot of use for foraging, unfortunately. The rate of foraging was very low. It was 0.05 observations per hour, which equates to about 1 foraging event for every 20 hours of observation time. And the majority of those were also chestnutback chickadees. Our second most common species seen foraging were pileated woodpeckers. And these guys do like highly decayed wood for foraging. One of their main food sources are carpenter ants and wood-boring beetles. And those are both found in wood that has more advanced decay. So we're not surprised that they like this wood for foraging. But again, we had very low use of these snags for foraging as well as nesting. So now we want to take that data and look at our historic data and make some comparisons over time to get a good timeline of use. So if we looked at our most recent survey, which was 2001, we can see nesting had actually decreased from 20% of snags being used in 2001 to only 11% being used in our 2015 and 2016 seasons. And the rate of foraging had also decreased. It decreased by about a factor of 8 since 2001. So we're seeing pretty strong declines in both nesting and foraging across all of our snags and our treatments. And we also wanted to look at the species change and if we had any additional species in previous years. So these top 4 in this top row, as you'll remember, were the ones that we had in 2015 and 16. In 2001, they had an additional strong excavator, this hairy woodpecker on the bottom corner. And they also had these 3 additional secondary cavity nesters. We have a house wren, a European starling, and a violet green swallow. Now, I do want to point out these 3 secondary cavity nesters, we don't really expect to see in our stands. They're what we consider open canopy nesters, meaning they prefer nesting in clear cuts, open fields, areas where there aren't a lot of there's not a lot of tree cover around their cavities. And the condition that we were working in with these 25-year-old stands, most of the snags were covered in the new growth. They were covered in the tree canopy. But we are surprised to lose one of our strong excavators, which does nest in closed canopy, the hairy woodpecker. And again, this just points to the fact that these snags are becoming more decayed and more softened and not providing as good a habitat as they once did. So looking at this a different way and now including our 1996 data set, you can again see that our strong excavators had the highest presence here in 1996 when snags were only about 5 years old and continued to decrease over time from 23% of total nests to only 6% of total nests being comprised of strong excavators. And this purple here, these are our weak excavators. You see that this is increasing, again, pointing out that softened wood and that more decay that they need for nesting. And then we had the highest amount of secondary cavity nesters as well in this first 5-year time period. And that's dropped off, which again is largely due to the changing landscape, as well as potentially some change in structure affecting their nest quality as well. So why is this important? Why did we spend so much time staring at dead trees, finding very little use? Well, really, this is information that goes back to forest managers and says it's time to create more snags. After 25 years, most of these structures were still standing, which may appear that you have wildlife habitat. However, what we found was that the advanced stages of decay that these were in were really providing very limited habitat and mostly providing habitat for our weak excavators. And again, providing a range of decay stages across the landscape is important. So this more advanced decay that we found after 25 years does provide habitat for weak excavators, also contributes to that nutrient cycling and habitat for other species, but we don't have a lot of habitat for the species that like the harder snags, the primary cavity nesters, the pileated woodpeckers, that we really consider to be more of a keystone species. So having snags in a forest that are a range of different decay stages and ages is going to provide the most quality habitat and the most habitat for the most diverse range of species that we can get. And that's really the goal that we're trying to create here when we're trying to add wildlife habitat back into these managed forests. When we're removing it and trying to add in quality habitat, we're looking to see if we can provide the best quality for the highest range of species to get back at that diversity that we've lost. So that's all that I have for you today. And I hope that you learned a little bit more about cavity nesters and snags and how we try to mitigate that in forested landscapes. And I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Yeah, go ahead and put your questions in the chat for Q&A for Amy. That photo of the pygmy owl was amazing.
Yes, that was, they're so cute. I just love getting to see animals like that nesting and how well they blend in. It's just amazing.
Okay, we have a question. Have no snags been made since 1990?
So if you're talking about in these particular stands, no, they did not create any more snags. So these stands were specifically set aside as research stands, so they don't do a lot of additional manipulation. However, there were natural snags that did form over time in these stands. And we had sort of a side study where we looked at some of those natural snags. I didn't include it in this presentation, but we did find more red-breasted sapsucker and more hairy woodpecker using some of those younger natural snags in the stands, which, you know, sort of just hones in on that point that these older snags are really too decayed, but they were in the stands and they were using some of those natural snags that had occurred.
So did your research, did it then, go on to the forest managers, and now we're kind of waiting for them to take action? Is that the next step?
Yeah, so definitely within the College Forest, they are always trying to increase the amount of snag and wildlife diversity that they have there. And then ultimately, we published this research, which was wonderful. So forest managers can use that as a resource to guide some of their management decisions. As a researcher, you can sort of put it out there, you can get it published and hope as many eyes get on it as possible. And then the forest managers are the ones that really take that into consideration to try to incorporate different age classes and different decay classes onto their landscape.
And would the timber industries be included in who's looking at that potentially?
Yes, they would.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Amy, thank you for doing this research, for those hours in the forest. Oh, and let's see, we have one more. Oh, we have a flurry of questions on this one. Oh. What time of year do you do the snag observations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we did our snag, so we did the nesting observations in the spring, the bird observations. So when we were trying to detect bird use of snags, we were looking at them from mid-April through June. And then when we were measuring characteristics on snags, we did that in the winter. We just did that sort of in the off season, just that we weren't disruptive. The characteristic surveys were a bit more intensive. We had to be a little closer to the snags, and we really tried to keep a good distance so that we weren't influencing use, that we weren't, disrupting during the nesting season, since it's so crucial for them to get in that full nesting season that they need to get enough fledglings out. But the bird observations were done from mid-April to June. And then the other snag characteristics looking at decay were done sort of in the middle of that, in the winter and in the fall.
And this will probably be our last question, but you mentioned these primary and secondary cavity nesting birds. What other species benefit from snags?
There are a lot of other species that benefit from snags. Flying squirrels use snags, bears will use snags, Douglas squirrels will use snags. They'll use them for winter roost. They'll also store food in them. Bats, of course, are a mammal species that use snags. I'm sure the list could go on and on for species that utilize them not only for nesting, but for foraging and climbing and protection and all kinds of things. So there's lots of different mammals that use snags as well as birds.
Oh, perfect. They really help everyone in the forest. I hope everyone learned something from this program. I definitely did. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening, everyone.